All right, hey everybody. Good morning. Almost noon, afternoon. I'm at Canei. I've been an indie developer for 9 years, and I also work at Hi-Res. I spent the first 5 years of my career as an environment artist, a year as a level designer, and now I'm a technical artist, which is a really vague title. If you want to know more about that, ask me at the end. This panel is multiplayer storytelling with art direction in Hanako, Honor, and Blade, which is an indie game I've spent the last 9 years working on. So multiplayer games are a little more difficult to tell stories, and because you're online, you're competing, there's players constantly trying to kill you. So when we started on this game, we tried to find a way, like how can we still get story across? Because it's important to me to be able to tell stories and inspire viewers and players, even though it's a multiplayer game. Even if it's like, oh, it has pretty art, this makes me want to make pretty art. Like at bare minimum, that's kind of our goal. So for us, our starting point, and really I think this is a good starting point for multiplayer games in general, and really you could use this for single player, is outline the basic details and premise. Look at your setting, look at the state of the world, see like who are the characters, or if since it's multiplayer and individual characters might not matter as much, what are the factions? And what's going on in that world? Like, is it war? Is it a time of peace? Like, where are you? Are you in Italy? Are you in Japan? Is it some alien planet where it's like alien monsters fighting each other? Start defining in an outline form what your basic details are of your game world. From there, that'll help guide your art style. Do you want a stylized art style, something that's cartoony, or like a subtle stylized art direction, or do you want something realistic, like the Call of Duty nitty-gritty? You can see the perfect shine on every metallic surface, and weigh the implications of each. It's important to understand your team and what they're capable of, to know if, hey, my artists on my team are really good at doing stylized or really good painters, so wouldn't make sense for like, oh, we're gonna do a Call of Duty super realistic, physical based rendering game. They're like, but we draw pretty. And from there, you can write and design your lore and design your art Bible. And an art Bible is basically just a giant document where you outline like color palettes, and basically it starts with this outline of your color palettes and mood boards and basically everything that defines art in the game. Like, here's what the clothing looks like, here's what the world looks like, and you'll see some of that stuff in future slides. And this kind of assumes you already have your basic design idea in mind. You already have the game kind of designed out. You know it's going to be online multiplayer, like class-based. That stuff's kind of resolved. Now it's time to think about the art. So for us, the basis of our art direction is personal relevance. This is me and my mom at different times of life. She passed away 10 years ago, almost to the day. And I was in college at the time, and I wanted to honor her memory. So I wanted to base the whole game around telling her story of her battling cancer. I wanted to try to form the factions around a kind of one faction representing her and the other faction representing disease, and kind of explore those themes. And it forced me to really look at it as an individual. And I treated it kind of how a musician writes songs. They write lyrics where everyone that listens to it's going to kind of take their own meaning from it. It's not really like shoved in their face of like, you have to interpret it this way. But it lets the audience kind of interpret it for themselves and find their own meaning and their own kind of inspiration or drive from it. So from that, we came up with two factions. The Hanako clan, which Hanako means flower child. My mom was a gardener. I knew I wanted the clan to be really heavily revolved around nature. So I broke it down into three sections: traits, what location they're in, and shape language. And you can see here, like, I wanted them to be honorable, defenders, highly skilled, diplomatic, empathetic, and a natural location for them in a feudal Japanese space, snow-capped, serene mountains. It kind of lend itself naturally. And then the shapes, kind of soft, curved, linear shapes, feminine shapes, kind of pristine and undisturbed, like very peaceful. From there, we picked three clan colors, which we went with red, gold, and white for the Hanako clan. And then the colors below are kind of like environment colors that we would sample to use. We knew the sakura cherry blossom tree would be very important in those territories, because I wanted, anytime there's a cherry blossom tree, that's also a gameplay element where you meditate under the tree, you heal faster. And that's something you guys can think about, is how can you use art direction to also message gameplay at the same time. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But it's like, what symbols can you use? Because a lot of games, they really rely on, like, Bethesda, you've heard this 100 times, floating text. They say, heal here, and it's big flashing letters everywhere, and it kind of handholds you straight to it. I think it's a better challenge to try to find art that can display the same thing, so you know, oh, there's a tree with falling petals there, I can go heal. And on the flip side, Yamai was the other clan that forced me to kind of look at the dark side of a tragedy and really face it head on from an artistic perspective. So Yamai literally is a translation of disease or illness, and their traits, of course, follow that: brutal, cunning, invasive, merciless. On their locations, kind of muddy, war-torn villages, forests, kind of like very muddy looking, very earth tone and dark. You can see that in the color scheme too. Angled, harsh, disturbed shapes. And then their colors, green, bronze, and black. So we knew that was a decision early on. We knew we wanted to have metallic accents for any faction that we make, so it helps them show out and pop when you're playing. So you see like the gold accents on a character, even from a distance, you know what clan they are, you know how to fight. We also knew that we wanted the characters to desaturate as they got closer to death. Color kind of serves as a symbol of life in the game. So as you're getting attacked and getting killed, you're losing your character's color. But we're leaving kind of the metallic accents behind in some cases. So once you have all those elements, you have your outline, you have your color schemes, your factions defined, or your characters defined. That's when we took all of that and transformed it into lore. So we have a writer for our game that basically I gave him the basic outline. I'm like, hey, I want a couple 100 years of backstory on how I want you to take my mother's story, her battling cancer, and transform that into a feudal Japanese war. How can you do that? So he took this as, we had the characterization of the two clans, and we had the Yamai clan basically kill the emperor, but he had two sons left, so they couldn't stake the throne. And this takes place during the Sengoku era, which we kind of changed history. And that era in Japan was basically their warring states period. There were dozens of clans warring. And in our story, we had the Yamai just wipe all of them out except for the Hanako clan. And they're kind of hidden in the mountains, so they're safe. And they rescue the emperor's sons to teach them their way of life. And also, Japan can't be an evil empire as long as those sons are alive. So that gives us kind of, if we wanted to do single player one day, we have that basis, but it also gives context to the battle. So I think just shoving people in a multiplayer match with no context, yes, a lot of games do that and it's really fun, but I think it adds another layer of depth that players can understand like why they're in a given map. And that was something we also took into our gameplay too, is we decided like, oh wait, this lends itself to doing an online campaign. Instead of doing a map cycle where like, oh, you played DE Dust, now we're going to play DE Aztec or whatever, the map that you play is based on what happened. So we knew we had these two polar opposite territories. We had this very dark, destroyed area and these really pretty areas. And we're going to start you in the middle, and depending on who wins, it's going to push you one map towards the losing team until you eventually get to their village, siege that, get to their castle, and then each level's kind of a different game mode and a different mode of play. So going back to kind of the art Bible thing, this is a Hanako clan mood board. And if you look at the traits from the previous slide, you can see those qualities there. You have the snowy mountains and the castle, and this is basically the stage where when you're forming your game, you can reference gather. Do mood boards, but also we have folders just categorized by buildings, landscapes, Yamai kind of landscapes, Hanako landscapes, and we're going through, and we just have this giant library to surf from at any time. Like, we have a folder of probably like every castle in Japan that we can go to at any time to be like, all right, I want a design element for this, so I can go in there, grab the reference, and get to work. Because when you're on an indie team, you might not always have a concept artist. If you're at a game studio, you're going to have a team of them. They can draw exactly what you need to make, and it's no problem. But we haven't had that luxury on our team, so a lot of times artists had to find something online, Google Images or wherever, and use that as reference and try to transform it and interpret it into our art style. And the Yamai version follows suit with their corresponding slide too. You can see the on fire forest, and this is exactly how we wanted it to feel. We kind of wanted I wouldn't say a shock factor in a sense. We didn't want it to be a really gory game because it is a stylized art style, but we still wanted players when they're there to feel uneasy. We wanted them to feel kind of the emotions that you would feel like dealing with like kind of what I went through. So this is what I was talking about before, establishing the opposing territories. This triptych kind of shows the gradation between the territories. In the middle is the battlefield that you start at, and it's kind of a neutral. It doesn't use too many colors from either of the clans, but it still has, you know, you have their spawn camps with their colors, and you kind of know where the starting point is, then you're converging in the middle. Then the left is the Hanako clan, right is the Yamai clan's territory. And the more that you branch out from the center, the more extreme the art style gets. So it's a little less noticeable to tell like where you are. You start to see elements from that clan. And then by the time you're at their castle, it's very clear. There's really not a lot of influence from the enemy. The other way we do that is with music. And music's super important in our game. We use it as a gameplay element. So we compose 3 tracks. We have a non-combat track, and that's really emotionally based. Our composer and I, we just sit down like, hey, okay, so this is what this map means personally. Like, for example, you'll see the castle map later, and in gameplay, that's the final stand. The leader's up against the wall. It's their last chance to defend themselves before the campaign's over. And I equate that to kind of my mom's last days. Like, she was in hospice, and it was like a really rough time, and it was kind of her final stand. So I equate those 2 things together, and I'd ask him, I want you to create the music that captures both of those. I want it to be like very intense, but very like emotional, and there's a peacefulness to that as well. So I'll play a couple of those. Should they play? So this is from the Hanako village map, and I told him his direction for this was, I want this level to feel like I get to see her again, because this is her village. Let me run to the sakura, just set the mood. So there's an idea of that, and then I'll open and show you an example of the Yamai side and how we try to create the characterization from kind of art and music. And it's important to try to have harmony between those things. It can really enhance the experience if everything kind of works together nicely. And it's the same thing like with our UI. Like, you may have noticed like the petals that are kind of flying off, and we use those as your health and kind of spirit stamina bars. Our composer was really challenged with that because it's not the same battle track for every map. It's 3 unique tracks for every map, and it's a little more extreme and a little closer to kind of hitting home with the themes. So I'll show you one more, then we'll move on. how our music works. If you want to hear the whole track, buy the game on Monday because it comes out finally. So I'm going to go through a couple shots of the different territories and kind of talk about the symbolism a little bit. This shot is from our map called Yari Foothills. It's kind of in between. You're kind of in the heart of the territory, the introduction of the territory. And this was, we wanted a really grand area to symbolize the entrance of the village without just putting like a torii gate there. And a guy in our team had a really good idea. He's like, hey, what if we put this giant suspended landmass and put a giant sakura and had it kind of fantastical, have bridges connecting to it, and that'll serve as kind of the entrance. And it'll kind of seem more of like a spiritual realm. So we did that and wanted the symbolism to be, we had this idea for these gazebos to kind of serve as a gateway. And the center is kind of like the spiritual realm, and then the sides where the gazebos are is kind of like the earthly realm. It's like the bridges connecting those two. And I kind of look at this as the land around it has fallen apart. All that's left is like this central spot. And this is the entry or the introduction to Hanako. Like, this is the introduction to my mother in a symbolic sense. So I want it to seem like no matter what's going on, no matter what's fallen away around you, there's still a path. There's still a path to oneness. There's still a path to staying positive and staying inspired and continue to kind of chase your aspirations. And it's another shot from the Hanako village, which you guys saw the daytime version on very low settings. It's kind of the same thing that her village, we wanted it to be very peaceful, have the waterfall, kind of the whole village is built around this giant waterfall, and you have the water rushing around the grand trees. And it's also like an important gameplay area. It's the kind of center capture point, and you have the falling petals there, and also at the same time, your village is being sieged by the enemy. They push you all the way back into your village, so there's kind of intensity to that. Then the castle you just saw as well, and heard a little bit about the themes before. And you can see the consistency in the color palette, and that's the important thing if you guys are designing multiplayer games or even single player, when you have different factions or different areas, even a single player RPG, the Skyrim kind of game where there's like 100 towns or whatever to go to. And they kind of have their unique characteristics, and that's what you want to define what those are. And then consistency is what makes a game come across as like a really high quality game. You go to any Hanako area, you should know just subconsciously from the color palette, like, this is that territory. Or you're making your games, like, this is a kind of a medieval castle area that uses this kind of brick or whatever, and you think about like where would these materials come from. You have to think about the actual construction if it was a real thing. Like, they have these bricks, where are they getting it from? They're in the mountains, so the kind of the color and the value of the mountains should be the same as your brick, because you're theorizing that they're gathering the materials from around their area. So if you have one brick that's like a gray and then like a completely different one somewhere else, it can kind of break the feature or break the illusion that you're trying to create. And it's a subtlety, but it matters. And this is the daimyo chambers in the castle. And this is really an important area in our game for a lot of reasons, because in this map, it's basically there's two VIPs. Players get to play as the leaders of the two clans. And if the home team's leader dies, like, that's it. That's the end of the campaign. And this is kind of his quarters. And also, one of our artists, Christian Buck, we all went to SCAD together different years, but it was really cool to have him work on these scroll paintings, because we lost one of our professors, Tony Sang. A number of you probably know or have heard of him before. He was the first supporter of this project. I was one of his first students, and he completely bulldozed the path for us to chase this 9 years ago. And losing him was a big deal for their program and for our game, because exploring loss and tragedy is such an important part of our art, and trying to transform it into something positive, and to remember the amazing people that have supported it along the way, whether they're still here or not. So he did a scroll painting that is very much to his likeness, and we were told a story about a week after about a hawk that was at his house the morning after he passed. And before that, for years, all there was just crows and random annoying birds, but for some reason that morning the tree was empty except a lone hawk. And they asked me to put hawks throughout the game to kind of remember him. So we have his likeness as the daimyo of the Hanako clan with the lone hawk. And I think this is a really cool way to, this is probably the most literal symbol in the game, whereas a lot of them are more subtle. We don't really like hammer like you should know this story in real life, what the actual story was all the way. It's just, it's symbolism. It's the same thing I mentioned with music. You don't know what the songwriter's exact memories were, but you know that there's like a depth to it. And then this is a shot from the battlefield that's in the middle. And you see, there's not really a clear indicator of who this belongs to. That's what we wanted. It's just you're starting off, you're getting your footing, you're trying to figure out kind of what's going on. And into Yamai territory. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory that we wanted it to feel just really brutal in a sense. We wanted to create these dark moments. And this is a shot from one of our trailers that you guys will see at the end. Of lots of fire particles, lots of grunge, lots of burned up and scorched areas. And it's an artistic challenge because breaking things has its own difficulties from a kind of an art perspective, like executing that. And it's an opportunity to explore, kind of both sides of the spectrum. And another shot from Yamai area. And we only have one map from this area. It's something like as we go into early access, we have 3 Yamai territory maps to go into. And really, it's something we've avoided for a long time because obviously working on the Hanako side is so much easier as an artist because I try to like really inject myself into the work and really like feel what the kind of mood or tone of the level is. So like going into the Yamai side is like siphoning, trying to siphon like the anger and suffering or anything that I've kind of gone through to try to inject it into the work. And it's difficult sometimes to like work on those kind of levels. You have to kind of like pick the right time. Another shot. And then this is something that actually shocked my team a lot. They were very surprised when I did this in the Hanako Castle level. This is the spawn area where the Yamai clan, basically I wanted to create a space where you can tell like they're in the castle, like it's near the end. You've lost. There's harmony between gameplay and storytelling. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's taking your props and your art libraries to create landmarks and to also like message your gameplay. It's important for users to be able to find where they're supposed to go without, and I think you can accomplish that without what I said before, like having arrows and mini-map and like go here, or audio cues, whatever the thing is. You can do that with your storytelling in your level and with means I'm going to go over now. So in the previous shot, because you see remnants of war, you see props that are toppled over, you see kind of this zone that has the Yamai clan colors and symbol, you can deduce without the game outright telling you like this is the Yamai area. They obviously siege this area. It has something to do with them. This is another small example of I have this lantern tipped over and it's kind of projecting the shadow of the helmet on the staff onto the wall. That's kind of a storytelling moment. The Yamai don't care. Like they're gloating about their victory and their siege, but also that light is pointing on the doorway that you're supposed to go. So you spawn and go up the stairs into this room. You might not know like what am I doing? What's my objective? This shows you like, oh, this doorway's lit. Maybe I should go out here. So if I go back to this stage, you'll see there's a lot of street lamps. There's a lot of lanterns that are casting light. And we put lanterns at the bottom and top of every stairway because those are leading you to kind of where you need to go. So it's the same thing for making a city game. You may have certain light posts that are burned out because you want the ones that are still illuminated to point the player in the right direction. That applies to single player or multiplayer. So going back to more of a technical side to kind of get to that point, I'm going to go over our pipeline and kind of our starting point. So usually really AAA studios and indies kind of handle it the same way, at least we did. we start with the territory art discussion. We know what territory it's in. We know it's a Yamai territory map. We know what the game mode is, but we want to define the setting and the mood and kind of define what the main areas are. It's like I went through it before with the map with the bridges connecting to the landmass. We knew we wanted this big grand introduction. So that gives the level designer a challenge. It's like, how can I create interesting gameplay that also leaves space for the art? From that point, once we decide that, we block out the level in basic shapes. In most game engines, it's called BSP, but it's just a way to just take like cubes and spheres and like little like triangular roof shapes, and you just want to kind of carve out your paths, because at that stage you really could start testing. For us, we lit the map so we know what the lighting mood is, because the lighting has a lot of impact on how a level plays in multiplayer. Where shadows are is important, because shadow generally, people are going to go towards light in maps. If you shadow out areas, typically they're going to stay away from them, unless it's like we put stealth in our game, for instance, where like the ninja class is in shadow, he's concealed or something. And that's deterministic on what your game design is. So once you have those steps, you can start playing the map and see if it's fun. Because once you've committed to making art for it and you've made art, if you find out later the level's not fun, you just made all this art and now it doesn't fit or it doesn't work anymore. So it's good to test early and often and figure out and be open to feedback at this point, because it's easy to tweak basic shapes. Then once the total map kind of takes form, then you can start doing your art placement. And for us, we worked big to small, and I think that's just an efficient way to work. When you're on an indie team, especially if you have day jobs and you can only work on it, maybe 4 or 5 hours a night, you can't afford to lose time because of inefficiency. You needed a good process. So we started big to small. What are the biggest things that take up the most space that we can reuse the most amount of times and kind of fill up a map? So the next play test, when a tester's gonna like, oh, there's all kind of stuff in here now, whereas a week before you just had basic gray shapes. From there, we do the next level down: walls, columns, guardrails, stairs, like mid-level architecture. And if something's important for gameplay, even if it's small, I would still consider that kind of in these first 2 steps, because you still want to see how the art is going to influence the testing once you play. Because sometimes you swap art in for a block out and now people don't understand, because the art, you either don't have the smaller lighting in place or the colors or the texturing of the object. It just kind of like you're like, oh, where do I go now? Like I knew where to go last week. From there, light sources, navigation lighting. That's your lanterns, your street lights, street posts, whatever you can come up with for your games to kind of line along paths. And it doesn't have to be so literal where every 10 feet you have a lantern and that's a little like on the head, and artistically like maybe you don't want that much lighting in there. So it kind of depends on what your game is. For ours, it served us well. From there, we do a gameplay props pass, and that's where like the main gameplay paths work well, everything else is working well, but there's a lot of open space still. And like a lot of houses you go in where there's nothing in there, it's a square room. You go in, you're just like, oh, this is exciting. It's a floor texture. Oh. And that's where we'll put crates in. We'll put in cover props and things for players to jump over or navigate around. And that's all based on a multiplayer level design theory that's all about establishing figure eights. And that's just how many like figure eights can you have that flow well together, and you create these micro paths within like your primary game paths. After that, we do foliage, grass, trees, and bushes. Sometimes trees can have pretty significant gameplay implications. Like I mentioned, the sakura tree for a healing area, we would place those sooner. But for trees that aren't important gameplay, or they're just kind of there to break up the space, we'll put those in at this stage. Then storytelling, props, and then your background. You don't really need to worry about your background too much because players can't get there. But at this stage, you can put in your background mountains and tree billboards or whatever else. And also props that only exist to tell a story. And it's important, as a tech artist, I'm an optimization guy, that you check your budget at each phase and to be mindful of game performance and frame rate. If you're putting tons of props in, you have like 1,000 lights all over the place, you have to be aware of what that's going to do to frame rate. Test your game on multiple types of computers if you can. If you have an old like Intel HD 3000 laptop, play your game on it, see how it runs, and see at each stage what impacts performance the most. Most of the time when you get to the foliage stage, there's tons of grass and trees everywhere. It's usually when performance starts to dip, and that's when you can use things like level of detail and culling, which basically at a distance it just makes the mesh disappear so you don't have to pay for it. And then at the end, we do optimization pass, bug fixes, and make sure that it's polished and ready to go. So these shots are a few examples. This is the Hanako castle at blockout phase, just simple shapes and ramps. And this is where it starts to present a challenge for the artist. I mentioned before, the level designer has to figure out, like, we have this mood and all these parameters, how do I make cool gameplay? Now this is like, I have blocks, how do I make this look good? So this is a construction shot. They were off that day, and they just got started on the 3rd level. And you can just see kind of the different phases of construction. And it's one of those things that requires a lot of patience, because once you start putting art in, you're like, well, this doesn't look good yet. And the tendency is you want to tinker with the art and go back and start to retexture stuff. It's like, just stick with it and keep going until you get all the phases done, and then you can look at it in the final phase and decide, like, all right, do all the colors work together? Does the fog make sense? Do I like the lighting? And this is another shot kind of before the background pass, before foliage. Like, we did put in important symbolism trees, but we hadn't yet done the full pass. And then this is kind of the final. It has your gameplay props, it has your story props, and full foliage pass. And this is an example of what I talked about, using the same asset and doing kind of the largest scale things. The cliff pieces that you see in here, it's one cliff that's used like 300 times in this level. And I always recommend that artists learn to make, we call them in the industry God cliffs, because they're so usable, and like they have so many different uses that they're like incredible pieces of art, where basically it's a 360-degree piece where it's every side is kind of sculpted differently. So no matter how you rotate it, you don't really see the repetition. And usually every art set, every territory, we do one of these, and the same thing for a rock, because you're going to use rocks and cliffs a lot if you have an outdoor game. So it's smart to reuse it. Why have like 20 unique rocks when you can have 2 that are sculpted in a way that you can kind of move them around and no one really notices? Same thing for trees. Rotate the tree 20 degrees, different tree. And this is an example of navigation lighting. We use this hallway to kind of lead you around the corner into the daimyo chamber that you saw before. It's a little extreme, but we wanted, because the Hanako clan traits, we wanted it to be very bright and vibrant from a color perspective and lighting. So it was kind of an art decision for story and following the faction traits, versus like, I wouldn't recommend putting this many lights just for navigation by itself. And I mentioned before, and I'll mention something about prop placement, because in a lot of games you'll see like the same stack of crates that are like perfectly 90 degrees stacked, or like the perfect 90-degree walls. I think it adds a lot of interest visually when you just do little small rotations to your props. So when you're world building, you know, rotating your crate 10 degrees so it's a little off kilter and it looks a little disturbed, like the tipped over sake container. I think those little details can make a big difference, and it helps your level feel lived in more. Because that's kind of a phase where it's one thing to make a multiplayer level that's fun and engaging and it looks good, but to create the illusion that there's a believable world where like people live or things happen here. If you weren't playing, you could deduce like, oh yeah, I can see like there's these supplies here, like a couple are tipped over. You can tell like, I don't have a screenshot here. Actually, I'll do it right now. I'm in the level. Like, I knew I had these 3 houses and they're more or less exactly the same looking. So the way to differentiate is what's inside of the house, what's around the house. So I put like a little armor, like weaponsmith fire and an anvil and like a seat for him, and you could see there's like a sword. And I dressed each house a little differently, so you see like the supplies in here. So when players are running through, they don't say like, oh wait, am I in this house or like the other house? I can't tell, the walls are the same. So using your props to kind of tell the story of like, what is this house? Oh, it's the weaponsmith's house. Versus you can see like, oh, this house has been overtaken, but if you came in here versus the other house, you should know that it's a different building. If you don't, then that's ineffective messaging, and it's something that we should fix. And then this is an example of just the background pass. Just having trees and mountains in the background and positioning the sun to where you get the nice like sun rays coming through the trees. And generally, you shouldn't put a lot of budget into your backgrounds, especially in a multiplayer game, but there's like so many tools like Unreal and Unity to kind of like create either like flat images of mountains or like combine your mountains and kind of give you like a super low poly version of just like span of mountains so you can get a nice horizon line. So after all of that, 9 years of work in art direction and things, I'll show you
It's a time of war, fighting for the future of Japan. Some seek a future through peace and harmony, others through steel and fire. Choose your side carefully and prepare for war. Fight your way through outposts, forests, villages, and castles. For once you've set out, there's no turning back. Defend with honor, or destroy with no mercy. Use your training and rally troops to your side. Every class of warrior brings something unique to the battle. Become one that suits your mood. You'll have to perfect your skills, master your weapon, to become a deadly force on the battlefield. Play as the fearless Kenshi, the immovable Naginatashi, or merciless ninja. Wounds exposed, honor to be restored, glory to be earned, and the future of a nation in your hands.
So before we get to questions, I have a question for you guys. So you've heard a lot about the game and kind of the background of it, and I'm curious, think how to formulate this best. So we have a lot of symbols in our game, but it's not immediately apparent to the player like what the personal side of it is. It's more, you can tell clan very bad, clan very defensive and nice and pretty, but beyond that, do you guys feel like the metaphors need to be a little bit more on the head or presented a different way? Or do you think that it's effective to leave it to interpretation? Anyone can raise their hand and answer that if they have any feedback. I'm curious. Yes?
I honestly feel like it's offensive when people beat you over the head. I like to kind of figure things out as I go through. So, I don't know, take that as you will. I don't think they need to be too on the nose because I'm like, alright, I'm not a 3-year-old. I could probably figure that out if you give me enough food. But when they do give it to you right away, it's like,
Yes.
I think it's at a good point where it leads the player on to sort of want to figure out more. And if they were to like research the game later on, it might become like an even stronger like attachment to a game if they like really like the idea of like one clan representing sort of disease and death. Kind of figure out like, hey, this sort of makes it a bit different what's into it. And I feel like them doing that research themselves would end up like making their attachment greater. So I think that's exactly how it goes with the point right now.
Awesome. Great feedback. Yes?
If you're going to do that kind of thing, it would be better in a cutscene and not really in the environment. And since this is a multiplayer game, it wouldn't really have that many cutscenes unless it was like the first time they're playing or something like that. Or if they wanted to see something in the menu where it's like more information, that kind of thing. But since it is a multiplayer game, I don't think anything beyond the environment would really suffice.
Yeah, I agree with that. We get asked all the time, like, why aren't you doing single player? Doesn't this lend itself to single player? I'm like, yes, but cutscenes are expensive, and so are voice actors and things, so we have to do multiplayer. Yes?
What you see in your head is always the best version for you. But when you go to watch the movie, it's like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. So I like it when it's showing up, give people a general idea of what's going on, and then they can fill in the gaps themselves. So it's the best version.
I agree with that. It seems like we have a consensus. Awesome. Thank you, guys. And we have We have a good bit of time. We have a solid 15 minutes for questions. So it's not limited to only topics in this panel. If you guys just want to know anything, I'm here for you guys. So it's open for questions. Yes.
How did you do your research for all the Japanese culture and stuff like that? Like, if I was into Norse mythology, how would I get started on creating a world like that?
I wish Christian was here. He's a big Norse guy. It was spaced out over so many years. Like when we first started, we had access to our college library, so I went and checked out like every Japanese history book they had, and we just flipped through and kind of looked at periods of time and what's the architecture style, because it changed over time too, and we kind of knew like what we wanted it to look like roughly, but it was kind of in reverse. We found the time period that fit what we wanted versus kind of I would feel like ordinarily you would do the research and then base it on the research. It's like we had our starting point and then we justified it with the research just to make sure. Like there were a lot of like we called it Hanako for a different reason at first, and then when I found out it was Flower Child later, I was like, yes, awesome, happy accent, like that's perfect, it fits like everything we wanted it to be. And we did, what else did we do? It's been so long. I think that's a good starting point. Like there were architecture books like solely on that. There was a weapons book that we went through that was like every Japanese weapon. There was one really cool one I remember it was like these translucent like rice paper pages, and each one was one layer less of armor. So you could see like how the exact like costuming worked, how all the layers of armor worked, and that was really cool for like our character artists to keep in mind. I doubt they have that for like everything. Like here's how Thor's armor layers on or whatever. But I think that's a good starting point, and of like mood boarding and just finding like examples of Norse architecture even through like other people's concepts, like even going through like deviant arts and stuff. Like people draw such crazy stuff that doesn't exist. You could never find like a picture of like an Asgardian temple, but you could find like other reference points of it to kind of drive like your art style or the creation of it. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Kind of going along with that, how did you settle on Japanese, the Japanese theme?
It was kind of a personal attachment. So going back, I'm gonna go back to when I was 14. That was the first year she got sick, like period. I was in high school still, and that same year, The Last Samurai came out, which became my favorite movie ever. And then that same year, I'd played Shenmue 2. And that game had a really personally applicable story. It was a really, like, nothing's inspired me more than that game. And that was kind of like, after playing that, I was like, I want to make games that do the same thing. I want people to be inspired after they play my games in the future to either chase their own dreams or become a game developer or whatever the thing is, just kind of morph games into like a positive medium. So both were centered on kind of martial arts and Eastern culture. And with that movie, too, it just all I knew kind of at that point, I was like, I want to make a samurai game one day. And then later when we did more research at the warring periods and kind of did these exercises to come up with the factions and the backstory, it just all kind of fit together nicely. Or we told ourselves it did. Yes? Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your experience working on this, but also having a position in the studio.
Extremely challenging. I actually don't recommend it. It's extremely tiring. It takes a lot of self-awareness first off, because you have to be able to compartmentalize. It's important not to let either one negatively pull down the other, which would be really easy. Typically, if you're working on your own game, you're probably a little more passionate about it because it's yours and you have full ownership over it. So it'd be easy to let that take away from like your career during the day. And you have to really be able to separate. Just be like, when I'm in this compartment, I'm doing these things with the same level of effort that I'm doing in this compartment. And also, even though I'm horrible at this, getting sleep is very important. I don't do it, and I wish I had, because 9 years of not sleeping much takes its toll. And just trying to be balanced, asking yourself like every day, even like, how balanced can I be? Am I spending enough time like doing this? What things can I trim out of my life that are useless or take up time that aren't as important as like the primary things? And it's good too. The positive side of that is you learn a lot of things, obviously, like in the industry that you would never learn just doing indie. Because we had opportunities early to just go full indie right out of college and do the bootstrap, like rent an apartment that we all live in and work on the game, 18 hours a day or whatever. And when I got my job, we kind of went a separate direction. And really, I think it was the best thing for the game, because I look back at like our old videos from that time, like our game would have been so bad if we stuck with it and released it. It would have been horrendous. And I'm thankful now for like the lessons learned from different mentors and stuff in the industry, because it would have never gotten to the point it's at now without that experience. So there's plus and minuses. If you're good at taking care of yourself and being balanced and you have awesome supportive people that push you away from being crazy and like going 24/7 into any given area, then it can work out. Any other questions? Yes?
How do you find players to look for symbology every day?
That's a good question. I think, I hope that they look for it. I can't really force them to. I've had that's why I was so surprised to hear pretty much unanimous feedback in here, because I've heard contrary feedback a lot too, that it's like, you guys make claims of this deep personal relevance, but I don't see any of it in the game unless I go to like our story page and actually read it. Like, I don't see the direct symbolism everywhere. And, the inclination was to be like, well, I'm not going to put a scroll painting of my mom on every level. Like, I'm not going to do that. It'd be absurd. And plus, the internet's a horrible place. I don't know what the internet's going to do with that. So I'd rather just refrain. So I think it's back to what some of you guys said. It's like, it's nice to, I think you mentioned it. It's like you take the best meaning for you from that art. So it's like, if you relate to a sakura tree in some way, or it evokes some kind of emotion in some sense, like that's your experience that is kind of unique to you. And I don't know how we could better, I don't know if it needs to be better or if it can be. Does that answer your question? Sort of. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm into SCAD, so
Mhm. Yay.
and I'm actually in art direction. We're kind of doing underwater scene
Mhm.
with VR, having some Chinese. I was wondering if you could give us any tips on that,
I'm doing an underwater scene.
or if it's like anything like working together with like the art director.
Yeah, what was your experience in senior studio?
Yeah. What tips would you?
Well, this was my senior studio. Oh yeah. Tell him I said hello. Scope was the one thing I wish I knew in senior studio. It's so easy when you're in college to go crazy with ideas, because that's like, you're so like, you haven't been jaded yet in any way or had any bad experiences. It's just making games, and it's awesome and exciting every day. And it's easy to just be like, we're gonna do this and this and this and this and this. Like we had, our Hanako senior studio was, I think, 16 maps and like 8 characters, and it was like 3 times the size of the game now. And, like, we were in college, and like, we're like, yeah, we can do this. We'll just stay up late. It'll be fine. Like, we'll just go to bed at 6 instead of 4. Like, it's fine. We got it. And so managing that, understanding like what your team's capable of, like you have to kind of look at like how many hours do things take, and if you have to throw something away or save it for after college, if you guys keep working on it, then I recommend that. As far as underwater scenes, cool caustic shaders.
That was actually one of my questions. Like, how did you sort of refine what kind of shaders you were using? I feel like with
Mm-hmm.
Or it seemed like scenes or certain scenes, screenshots that we had, they only seemed like the album to really show up whether it was like a lot of sharper value.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what kind of opportunities do you go through for stuff like that, and what kind of like direction did you go with as far as like what getting into the art style you wanted to use to show that?
I think early on we had actually a realistic art style, and as the story evolved and we started, really it changed when we did the map with the bridge. That was kind of a turning point for the game. That's probably like 3 years ago. We were still realistic then, and when we made that, we were like, this kind of has a fantasy feel to it a little bit, and the way the game's going, I think we can hit the Hanako traits better if we go stylized. So luckily I had one of my best friends worked at Telltale at the time, and he was like, hey, I'm going to teach you how to do better stylized stuff because that's what we do at Telltale. So he taught me a lot of really cool tricks. And that's also when we brought in like the cell shader, the outline shader. And I actually think it needs improved a lot. One of the feedback I get from all my mentors is like, I hate your edge shader. You don't see it against the skybox. It looks bad on foliage. And I tend to agree with that. It's one of those things, it's like you have a giant list of things to do, like fix cell shaders, not at the top. So it's one of those things I think will change during early access. But for where it works, I like that it brings out the stylization more. We use it to outline characters too. Like there's a red outline for enemies, and we use it for gameplay also. But I like how it makes props look, and it helps bring out the kind of stylization more. When I turn it off to test, because I was curious, it's like, well, is this feedback valid? Let me turn it off and run around the levels. They lose their feel. It starts to feel a little more realistic, even though the textures are stylized. I don't like the effect gone, though it's gone on min settings. Yes?
I was just curious, what is your opinion on what you would prefer, like have artistic pieces to build a story for, or have a story and craft art?
I think both are valid. I mean, of course you could do it either way, because there's like 100 ways to do anything games-wise. For most of our stuff was the big picture in a level, was the story was written and we made the art around it. On a smaller scale, like the examples of the weaponsmith stuff in that house, that was us crafting art to tell story. So we used, on a macro level, it was story to art. On a micro level, it was art to story. I mean, you could do it differently, but that's how we chose to tackle that. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have any general advice from what you've learned over time, like managing a game over 8 years?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway was how to treat people. When you're working on a game for that long and trying to keep a consistent staff and you can't pay them, you have to be really careful in how you communicate. And that communication is so important in any career, especially games where it's departmental, and there's like, at a AAA studio, you might interact with 20 people to do one assignment, and learning how to respect people and how to talk to them correctly, because I always felt like if I screw this up, they're going to quit because I'm not paying them. They have no reason to really stay other than like they love the game and love working on it. So treating it really carefully and making sure that you listen, it's really important. And I've seen it hundreds of times. Leaders of projects don't listen to feedback enough. And you have to take it from everywhere you can get it. And not all feedback's going to be great feedback. You're going to get negative people that are just or trolls or whatever. But you have to try to filter that into is there anything actually useful, or are they trying to say something and they're just being a-holes about it? What can you kind of extract from that? But for your team members, it's just hearing them out, because they're going to have ideas or they're going to disagree, and it's okay to disagree. And I constantly challenge the team, guys, keep the game as your primary intention. If your heart's towards making the game the best it can be and everyone's heart's in that same place, then debates kind of handle themselves. They might get heated, but because everyone's focused on let's make this as awesome as we can, then there's never egos don't swell. And that kind of management, and it helps people feel motivated, because if you're a junior artist on a team and you talk to your lead hey, I really don't like the way we're putting trees in this level. I think there's too many and blah, blah, blah. And you're there are two questions I always ask myself when I get feedback, especially when I disagree. One was, if this idea was coming from a vacuum and didn't have an identity attached to it, it wasn't my idea, or even though I disagree with it, does it make the game better? Like actually, like in a vacuum, will the game be better if we did this suggestion? If the answer is yes, then we do it. It's just as simple. It doesn't matter if I disagree at that point. If I can honestly, like, aside from my opinion of this, will the game be better if we do the thing? All right, then we do it. And that's really helped the team, and just trying to keep them motivated and really scanning their moods day to day. Like we do Google Hangout meetings and learning like even body language and verbal cues. So you can tell like, wow, you know, this guy sounds really tired. He sounds exhausted. Like let's pull him aside after and talk and hear him out and make sure that everything's okay. And doing constant maintenance with your team has really helped from like a leadership perspective. And that matters too on like senior projects and school projects too, because you're working collaboratively. And I think I speak from experience, like students tend to be really overzealous and they're really attached to their ideas and their work, and some classes kind of lend themselves to training you to take feedback, and everyone should always learn to take feedback with grace. And once you can, then you can really extract usefulness even if you hate the feedback. Even if deep down you're really annoyed by it, you can still at the end of the day be like, you know what, I think they don't like it, they think it's weird, they have a different idea, I disagree, but I actually think this has some merit to it, so let's explore that. And also knowing like where to cut that off. Like we have our plans, we have our feedback. If that doesn't mix well, when to stick with the plan and when not to. It's a long answer. Yes?
So I'm a game programmer, but I also like to write story on the side. And my challenges with the alliance and the horde of artists and programmers. Being on the programmer side, I have a hard time finding artists for the ideas that I have for a game. So what would you suggest as a resource for finding good artists that you can mesh with your ideas?
That's a hard one, because artists usually
Yeah.
want to be artists and not make art based on more logical ideas. Not that they are, they
Like
might be.
mechanics
Yeah,
and things
right,
like that.
right. I think you have to be flexible first off, and you have to be willing to let them mold the clay you're giving them, and be okay with like letting go of that a little bit. Like, as long as you can keep the walls and the structure of your project like that, you still have boundaries, because you can't just like, all right, I have 4 artists, you guys do what you want and I'll code it, and then it turns into like, oh, this isn't even my game anymore. Like, find the line where like, this is my game, this is not my game, and see if they're willing to be involved. But artists have to be heard out probably more than programmers, in my experience, having to work with both all the time. Artists want to be heard, they want to have an attachment to the work, and you have to be able to make them feel that way, or like genuinely give them the opportunities to, mold it into what they think works. Because, they may interpret things, and a lot of times I have the argument, like, I want to do something in the game because it's cool, and there's like, well, this doesn't make any sense, like, logically, this would never happen. Like, well, it's a game, like, it's a game, you can do it because it's a video game and it's not real life. This is why we're doing it, because I can't go under a tree and sit down and get my health back. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Ooh, 2 minutes over. We did good. Yes.
What age were you when you wanted to do this work?
Like game development in general, or 14 for game development as a whole. I knew I wanted that to be my career choice. Hanako. I had the idea for a samurai game around like 14 or 15, because I was making like samurai levels for like Jedi Knight games back in the day. Then probably when I was 19, like pretty much immediately after she passed, I was so engulfed in like the college experience, like working on projects and learning. It was kind of like an immediate thing. Like she passed October 9th, and then like we had winter break from like Thanksgiving through New Year's, really long winter break. All I did was write the game that entire break. That's all I did for 6 weeks, was just like, the first design document was like 80 pages. It was insane. But that was kind of like the basis for everything. I was like, all right, I'm doing this. And it was here. And I grew up in Woodstock, Georgia. And then now I'm in Alpharetta now. Any other questions? All right, guys, thanks so much for your questions and hanging out. Hope you learned something.